One woman, three orphaned girls, 43 cents, and an entire town that wanted them gone. Marin Calloway stepped off the train with empty hands and a shattered heart. The man she had traveled west to marry was dead. The land she had come to call home was nothing but ash and black stone. But the worst part wasn't any of that, because buried deep beneath that ruined earth was a secret worth an entire valley, and there was a man willing to kill to keep it hidden forever. She had lost everything once before: her son, her future, her reason to stay alive. She had boarded a westbound train because standing still had become unbearable, because she needed somewhere new to put what little remained of herself. What she found instead was a fight for three little girls the town had already written off, a fight for land that everyone called worthless, a fight against the most powerful man in the territory, a man who had been stealing this valley quietly, legally, and patiently for over a decade, and who had never once been made to answer for it. Until now. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the name of the city where you're watching. I want to see how far this has traveled. Stay until the very last moment, because this is a journey you won't want to miss a single second of. Blackstone Ridge, Colorado Territory, October 1883. The train didn't slow gently into Blackstone Ridge. It lurched, shuddered, and groaned to a stop like an animal that had been shot and was only now deciding to fall. Steam hissed from the iron belly of the locomotive and swallowed the platform whole, and for a long moment the passengers inside Car 7 sat suspended in a gray fog, unable to see what waited for them on the other side of the glass. Marin Calloway saw it, though. She pressed her fingers against the cold window and stared out at the town through the veil of steam. A collection of warped wooden storefronts, mud-choked streets, and the skeletal frame of a church steeple that looked as though it had given up halfway through its own construction. A hand-painted sign nailed above the depot entrance read, Blackstone Ridge, Estant 1871. Beneath, someone had scratched, in deep, angry letters, Population Enduring. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She was 31 years old, and she had the eyes of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes inside that span. Dark circles had taken permanent residence beneath her hazel irises. Her dark hair, pinned back with 2 tortoiseshell combs, had begun to work itself loose somewhere past the Kansas border. Her dress, black wool, mourning cloth, still mourning, was travel-creased and slightly too large for the frame she now carried, having lost weight she had never intended to lose. In her left hand she held a small leather traveling bag. In her right, a bundle of letters tied with a pale blue ribbon. The letters were from a man named Edmund Greer, a widower, a rancher, a man of apparently modest fortune and reportedly decent character, according to the matchmaker's correspondence that had first introduced them 8 months ago. They had never met in person. They had exchanged 22 letters over those months, careful, measured, tentative letters that had gradually grown warmer, more candid, almost tender. Edmund had written about his land with the kind of reverence that people usually reserved for living things. He had written about the valley at dawn, the way the light hit the ridgeline and turned everything gold for exactly 4 minutes before the ordinary morning took over. He had written, I think a person can belong to a place the way they belong to another person. I think that is what has happened to me here. I hope, in time, it might happen to you too. Marin had read that letter 7 times. She had packed her bags 3 days later. She was not foolish enough to call it love. She was not even sure she was capable of love anymore. Not since Daniel. Not since the fever that had taken her 5-year-old son 18 months ago in their cramped apartment in Cincinnati. Not since she had sat at his bedside for 4 nights watching the life drain out of someone she had poured her entire self into. After that, the apartment had felt like a coffin. The city had felt like a grave. Every familiar face had felt like an accusation. She had needed to go somewhere she had never been. Somewhere no one knew her name or her loss or the particular shape of her grief. Edmund Greer's letters had given her a direction. Now she stood on the platform of Blackstone Ridge's train depot with 43 cents to her name, her traveling bag, and a bundle of letters written by a dead man. She had learned the news from the station master, a round-faced, apologetic man named Briggs, who had clearly been rehearsing how to tell her since he'd received the telegram. Edmund Greer had died 11 days ago. Heart failure, they said. Sudden, at 54, in his sleep. His ranch hand had found him in the morning. There had been a small funeral, The ground had already been closed over him. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Briggs had said, turning his hat in his hands. Is there someone I can send for? Family you could wire?" "No," Marion had said, "there isn't." She had stood very still for a long moment. She had not cried. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she had used up all her crying 2 years ago, sitting in a chair beside a small bed in Cincinnati. Perhaps because somewhere beneath the shock was a quieter, more terrible truth she didn't yet have the courage to face. That she had come here not just for Edmund Greer, but because she had needed to believe that something was still possible, that a new life could be built from paper and ink and the stubborn, irrational act of boarding a train and going west. And now she stood in the mud of Blackstone Ridge with 43 cents and no plan. The town council met in the back room of the Granger's Supply Building on Main Street. 4 men arranged around a table scarred with years of coffee rings and hard decisions. Marion had asked Briggs where she might find local authority, and he'd pointed her here with the expression of a man pointing someone toward a dentist. She pushed the door open without knocking. The 4 men looked up. Their expressions moved through the same rapid sequence: surprise, assessment, dismissal. The man at the head of the table had the angular, well-fed look of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room. He had silver hair swept back from a high forehead, a gray coat that was expensive by frontier standards, and eyes the particular pale blue of winter ice, cold not from the weather, but by nature. He was perhaps 55. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. This, Marion would later learn, was Magistrate Corwin Hale. "This is a closed session, ma'am," said one of the other men, younger, with a nervous mustache. "If you have business with the council, you'll need to submit a formal—" "I'm Marion Calloway," she said. "I came to marry Edmund Greer. I understand that isn't possible now." She kept her voice level. She had practiced level. "I'm asking the council what provisions exist for a woman who has arrived in your town with no employment, no lodging, and no family, and I'm asking what is being done for the Hartwell children." A silence fell over the room. The man with the nervous mustache exchanged a glance with the man beside him. Hale said nothing. He only watched her with those pale, patient eyes. "The Hartwell situation is being handled," said the 4th man, heavy-set and bearded, without looking up from his papers. "I've just come from the depot platform," Marion said. "The station master told me the 3 Hartwell girls have been at the church hall for 2 weeks since their father's death. I understand you intend to separate them, send the eldest to work in a household in Ridgecroft, place the middle one with a farm family in the north, and send the youngest to an orphanage in Denver." "That is the arrangement that has been made, yes," said the nervous mustache. "It's the most practical—" "It's cruel," Marion said. Hale spoke for the first time. His voice was mild, almost conversational, in the way that very powerful men's voices often are. They don't need volume. "Miss Calloway, you arrived in this town approximately 2 hours ago. You have no property here, no employment, no established reputation, and—" he glanced briefly at her traveling bag, "apparently no resources. I wonder if you might be better served by concerning yourself with your own situation before attempting to involve yourself in matters of local governance." "With respect, Magistrate," Marion said, "I am involving myself in matters of local governance because the local governance appears to be failing 3 children." Hale tilted his head very slightly. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was the gesture of a man filing something away. "The Hartwell property burned," said the bearded man. "There's nothing left. The father died in debt. The land's been assessed as near worthless. No water, bad soil. Those girls have nothing. They have each other," Marion said, "and they have that land, which is worth nothing. Then no one will object if I claim guardianship of the girls and take possession of the homestead." She set her traveling bag down on the nearest chair. She had no legal knowledge, no precedent, no plan. Only the absolute certainty that if she walked out of this room without fighting for something, she would not know what she had come here for. "I am a woman of adult age. I am without criminal record, and I am willing to take on the responsibility. I am asking the council to recognize my claim." The room was very quiet. "You have 43 cents, Hale said. He said it without malice, which somehow made it worse. Simply as a fact. A closed door. Marion looked at him steadily. "Then I suppose we had better get started." The Hartwell girls were waiting in the church hall. A drafty clapboard building at the end of 2nd Street that smelled of candle wax and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that had been used for too many hard occasions. They were seated on a bench against the far wall. 3 of them, in order of height. The eldest, perhaps 11 or 12, the middle one, maybe 8, and the youngest, Marin would learn her name was Lucy, no older than 5, with tangled copper hair and a rag doll clutched against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things they are afraid of losing. The eldest, Abigail, saw Marin first. She had dark, watchful eyes and the expression of a girl who had decided, at some recent and terrible point, to stop trusting anything that presented itself as good news. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a child who had learned to perform composure. The middle one, Nora, was turned sideways on the bench, drawing something in the dust on the floorboards with her finger. She looked up when Marin entered, and her face was open and unguarded in a way that Abigail's wasn't, the face of a child who hadn't yet built all her walls. Lucy didn't look up at all. She just held her doll. The church matron, a Mrs. Ida Pell, wide and efficient, with the air of a woman who processed difficult situations by converting them to logistics, stepped forward to intercept Marin before she could approach the bench. "The children are being prepared for their departure tomorrow morning," Mrs. Pell said. "If you're here about the council's arrangements—" "I'm here about the children," Marin said. She stepped around Mrs. Pell, who made a sound of mild outrage but did not physically stop her. Marin crossed the hall and stopped in front of the bench. She crouched down so that she was at eye level with all 3 of them, or as close as she could get. "My name is Marin," she said. "I'm sorry about your father." Abigail's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's been dead 3 weeks," she said. "People keep saying that." "I imagine they do," Marin said. "It doesn't help much, does it?" Abigail blinked, slightly thrown, it seemed, by someone not arguing with her. "Are you from the council?" Nora asked. She had set aside her dust drawing and was studying marine with frank curiosity. "No, I just argued with the council, which is slightly different." "Did you win?" Nora asked. "Not yet." Lucy very quietly and without looking up said, "Are they going to separate us?" The word separate landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Marin looked at the smallest girl. Lucy's eyes were still fixed on the doll, a worn, faded thing with button eyes and a dress made from what looked like flour sacking. "I'm trying to make sure that doesn't happen," Marin said. "But I have to be honest with you. I'm a stranger in this town. I don't have much money, and the land your father left, I've been told it's in bad shape. If I claim guardianship of the 3 of you and take possession of that homestead, things will be very hard. Maybe harder than you can imagine right now." A long silence. Then Abigail said, in a voice stripped of everything except the question itself, "Will we be together? That is the only thing I can promise you." Something shifted in Abigail's expression. Not trust. Not yet. But the door to trust, opening perhaps 1 inch. The Hartwell homestead was 3 miles east of town, at the end of a rutted track that the recent autumn rains had turned into something closer to a river than a road. They made the journey the following morning, Marin and the 3 girls, loaded into a borrowed wagon driven by a man named Caleb Dodd, a taciturn former farmhand who had worked the Hartwell property briefly and who, when Marin had explained the situation, had said only, "That land's got problems," and then agreed to drive them anyway. When they crested the low ridge and saw the property for the first time, Marin understood what burned out meant. The farmhouse was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The fire had consumed it so completely that what remained was a rough rectangle of blackened foundation stones and a single wall section that stood upright for no visible reason, charred and skeletal, like a monument to something that no longer existed. The barn had fared slightly better. Half of it still stood, though the roof on the east side had collapsed inward, and the boards that remained were smoke-darkened and warped. The fields were overgrown. The fence line had broken in a dozen places. A stone well, perhaps 30 feet from where the house had been, stood unfinished. The wooden housing had burned away, and the shaft was covered only with a piece of rotting timber that sat crooked across the opening. Nora made a sound, but not quite a gasp. More of a held breath. Lucy pressed closer to Marin's side without saying anything. Abigail stared at the ruins of the house for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, Papa started that well the month before he died. He said it was the most important thing on the property. Marin looked at the well. Why? He never told us. Abigail's voice was carefully controlled. He just said it was important. He spent every morning out there for almost 2 months. She paused. He was excited about it. I hadn't seen him excited in a long time. Caleb Dodd climbed down from the wagon and surveyed the ruin with the detached air of a man who had seen too many things go wrong to be surprised by it. You're going to need timber for the house. You're going to need seed if you intend to put in a spring crop. You're going to need food for the winter, which is maybe 8 weeks away. He looked at Marin. You got 43 cents, ma'am. I don't know if you've thought through the arithmetic. I've thought through the arithmetic, Marin said. It doesn't work. No, it does not. So we'll need to find a different kind of arithmetic. Dodd looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. Something that had forgotten how to laugh, but remembered the direction of it. There's a root cellar behind the barn, he said, still intact. Hartwell put up some stores before he died. Not much, but it's something. And there's a creek half a mile north. Doesn't run dry until February, usually. He looked around at the property with a different expression now. The expression of a man doing calculations of his own. I don't have anywhere particularly pressing to be until spring. Marin looked at him. I can sleep in the half of the barn that's still standing, he said, with elaborate casualness. If you're agreeable. I'm agreeable, Marin said. She turned and faced the ruins. The wind came in off the ridge and moved through the dry grass around the foundation stones, and the charred wall section creaked faintly in it, and the whole place looked as though the land itself was waiting to see what she would do. All right, she said, to the land, to the girls, to herself. She reached down and took Lucy's hand. Let's find out what we've got to work with. The root cellar held 30 pounds of dried beans, 2 crocks of salted pork, a sack of cornmeal, several jars of preserved tomatoes, and a tin box that Abigail recognized immediately. That's Papa's, she said. Her voice was sharp with something. Recognition, protectiveness, grief. The tin was locked with a small brass padlock. Marin set it aside. We won't open it yet, she said. It belongs to your family. We'll keep it safe until we know more about what it contains. Abigail looked at her for a moment, then gave a single small nod. The look on her face was complex, the specific expression of a child recalibrating an adult against a first impression. They slept that first night in the intact half of the barn, on hay that Dodd laid down fresh from a small remaining stack, covered with the 2 blankets they'd found in the cellar. Marin lay awake long after the girl's breathing had slowed into sleep, listening to the wind move across the ridge and the occasional settling creak of the damaged roof above them. She thought about Daniel. She always thought about Daniel in the dark, could not seem to stop it, had given up trying. She thought about the weight of him in her arms when he'd been very small, and the particular laugh he'd had that started low and built until it was almost more hiccup than laughter, and the way he'd said her name, Mama, as though it were its own complete sentence. She thought about the version of herself that had boarded the train in Cincinnati, hollow-eyed, half-present, moving west because staying still had become unbearable. That woman had been looking for something without knowing what it was. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace. Something more fundamental than either. Something like purpose. Like a reason to continue being in the world at all. 3 small, warm shapes were breathing in the hay beside her. The land outside was ruined and cold and nearly worthless, and winter was coming, and she had 43 cents in a tin box she hadn't opened. She closed her eyes. All right, she thought. Not to anyone in particular, just the thought itself, precise and clear. All right, let's see what this is made of. She meant the land. She meant herself. She wasn't entirely sure there was a difference anymore. The first week was a kind of controlled emergency. They patched the barn roof with salvaged boards and what remained of a tarp Dodd found folded beneath the workbench. They mapped the property on foot, 32 acres, mostly flat in the south, rising toward rocky high ground in the north, with the creek Dodd had mentioned running cold and clear through a stand of cottonwoods at the property's edge. Abigail worked with the efficiency of a girl who had been a farmer's eldest child and had learned early that a farm will not wait for grief. She showed Marin and Dodd where her father had been building fences, which sections of the field had been cleared, which hadn't. She knew the land with the intimate, unsentimental knowledge of someone who had grown up walking it. She did not talk much about her father while she worked. She talked about what he'd done and what still needed doing, and it seemed, at least for now, to be enough. Nora was quieter in a different way, observant, precise, with an artist's attention to detail. She had been drawing in the dust of the church hall. She drew here too, with a stub of charcoal she found in the ruins of the house. She sketched the barn, the field, the unfinished well. She sketched Marin without being aware she was doing it, sitting nearby one evening while Marin was mending a torn pocket on her coat by firelight. "You look sad when you think no one's watching," Nora said, matter-of-factly, still looking at her sketch. Marin paused in her mending. "I suppose I do," she said. "Are you sad about Mr. Greer?" She had to think about that. "Partly," she said honestly, "partly about other things." "My papa said sadness doesn't go away," Nora said. "He said it just changes shape." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was pretty smart," Nora said, with the particular combination of pride and past tense that children who have lost parents carry. "Sometimes he was wrong about things, though, like the well." Marin looked up. "What do you mean?" Nora shrugged. "He kept saying it would fix everything. I didn't understand how a well could fix everything." She looked at her drawing. He was down in it for hours sometimes, measuring things, writing things down. A pause. "That tin box in the cellar? He put stuff in there the week before he died." Marin set down the coat. She thought about the tin box sitting now in the corner of the root cellar under an old cloth. She had told Abigail they would leave it unopened until they knew what it contained. She was beginning to think she needed to know what it contained. They opened the tin box on the 7th evening. The 4 of them, Marin, Abigail, Nora, Lucy, sat together in the lantern light of the root cellar, the box between them on an upturned barrel. Even Lucy, who had been quieter than the others and still hadn't said more than a handful of sentences since Marin's arrival, leaned forward and watched with wide eyes. The padlock key, it turned out, was on a cord around Abigail's neck. She'd had it the whole time. She held it for a moment, the small brass key in her palm, and looked at the box with an expression Marin couldn't fully read. Grief and something else. Something almost like fear. "He gave me the key in August," Abigail said. "He said to keep it safe and not to open the box unless something happened." She paused. "I don't know if he knew something was going to happen." "Open it," Nora said, with the practical certainty of an 8-year-old. Abigail took a breath and fitted the key to the lock. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilskin to protect them from damp, were a stack of papers. Handwritten notes in a dense, cramped hand that was clearly Edmund Hartwell's. Survey documents, hand-drawn diagrams, careful measurements, a map of the property, annotated in the margins in blue ink, and a letter addressed in slightly different handwriting, larger, more deliberate, to whoever finds this, and to my daughters. Marin read the letter aloud. It was not a long letter. Edmund Hartwell had not been a man of excessive words. But the words he had chosen were measured and specific, and as Marin read them in the lantern light with 3 girls listening, they slowly became something extraordinary. "The well is not an ordinary well," he had written. "What I found, when I began to dig, was evidence of something I have spent 6 months now studying and mapping. There is water here, not in the quantities that a standard well provides, but a vast underground basin that feeds this entire valley. I have traced its reach through the survey maps, through the rock formations, through the patterns of what grows and what dies across this land. The basin extends beneath nearly every ranch in this valley. I know who else knows about it. I know what he intends to do with it. His name is Corwin Hale." The lantern flame moved in a draft from the cellar door. "Hale has spent years acquiring land and legal authority in this territory by a specific method. He allows ranches to fail, then purchases the water rights at collapse price. What most people do not know is that the water rights in this valley are worth nothing individually. But if one entity controls all of them, controls access to the underground basin, that entity controls the valley entire. Every ranch, every family, every livelihood that depends on water here. Hale has been engineering this for over a decade. I have the evidence. All of it is in this box, beneath the oilskin. I do not know if he knows I know. I believe he may suspect. I have continued digging the well because it is the only thing that makes sense to continue, and because I intend, when it is finished, to bring what I have found to the territorial authorities in the capital. If you are reading this and I am not there to have done that, then it falls to someone else now, to my daughters. I love you. I have always loved you more than I could ever say correctly. This land is yours. Do not let anyone take it from you." Marin stopped reading. The cellar was very quiet. Lucy, without a word, reached across the barrel and took Marin's hand. Her fingers were small and cold, and she held on with both of hers, and Marin held on back. Abigail was looking at the papers in the box with an expression that had moved far past grief into something harder and clearer, something that looked like understanding. "He knew," she said. It was not a question. "He knew," Marin said. "Is Hale the one who—" Nora stopped. She was looking at Marin with eyes that had grown older in the last 30 seconds. "I don't know," Marin said honestly. "Not yet." She reached into the box and lifted the oilskin. Beneath it were the survey documents, the measurements, the annotated maps. Months of work. Careful, meticulous, undeniable. She sat in the lantern light of a root cellar on a ruined homestead at the edge of the winter-coming frontier, with 3 girls watching her and a dead man's evidence in her hands, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when every other option has been removed, exactly what she had come here to do. She had come here with nothing. 43 cents, a bundle of old letters, and a grief she hadn't known how to put down. She looked at the papers in her hands. She looked at the 3 faces watching her. Abigail's fierce and frightened, Nora's sharp and waiting, Lucy's small and entirely trusting. "This land is yours," Edmund Hartwell had written. "Do not let anyone take it from you." "All right," Marin Calloway said, for the second time in a week, to the same uncertain dark, with the same absence of certainty and the same absolute determination. "All right." She set the papers back carefully in the tin box and closed the lid. "Get some sleep," she said quietly to the girls. "We have a great deal of work to do." Outside, the wind moved across the ridge, and the unfinished well stood open in the darkness, patient as a secret, waiting for someone with the courage to go all the way down. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The morning after they opened the tin box, Marin rose before the others. She had slept perhaps 3 hours. Not from fear, though fear was present, a low hum beneath everything, but because her mind would not stop moving through the papers she had read by lantern light. Edmund Hartwell had been meticulous. The survey documents were dated across 6 months, each one building on the last. The hand-drawn maps showed the underground basin's reach in careful, annotated detail. The rock formations, the depth measurements, the points where the water table pressed closest to the surface. He had cross-referenced property lines, legal boundaries, water right filings. He had understood exactly what he had found, and exactly what it meant, and exactly who intended to steal it. She built the fire in the small iron stove they'd dragged from the barn ruins and set in the surviving corner of the structure, and she sat with the papers spread across her knees in the gray pre-dawn and read everything again. All of it, every margin note, every diagram. Edmund Hartwell had spent his last months of life building a case that could dismantle the most powerful man in the territory, and then he had died with it locked in a tin box in his root cellar, and now it sat in the hands of a widow from Cincinnati with 43 cents and no legal standing in this county, this territory, or any other. Outside, the wind was still. The ridge was dark against a sky just beginning to consider the idea of light. She thought, what would a reasonable person do? She thought, sell the information, find a lawyer, write a letter, wait. She thought, a reasonable person wouldn't have claimed guardianship of 3 orphans with 43 cents. She folded the papers back into the oilskin and put them in the tin box and set it beneath a loose hearthstone she had identified the evening before. Then she went to start the morning. Caleb Dodd was already awake, moving around the barn with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been rising before dawn for 20 years and had stopped noticing it. He looked at her when she emerged, read something in her face, and said nothing. He handed her a tin cup of coffee made over a small campfire outside the barn door. Real coffee, which she hadn't asked about and didn't ask about now, just accepted and held with both hands while the steam rose against the cold morning air. "You read those papers," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, Bad? Yes, she said, but also useful. He looked at her sideways over his own cup. Useful, he repeated carefully. Hartwell built a case, a detailed one. If the right people see what he found— The right people, Dodd said. He said it with a flatness that wasn't cynicism exactly, more like a man reciting a lesson he'd learned the hard way. There aren't many right people in this territory that Hale hasn't already bought or scared into silence. Town council's his. County sheriff took his money 2 years ago. Everyone knows it, nobody says it. The circuit judge comes through twice a year and doesn't stay long enough to make enemies. He paused. Territorial capital is 4 days by horse, 6 by wagon, and that's before winter closes the mountain pass. I know, Marin said. So what's useful about it? She looked at the unfinished well across the yard, standing in the early half-light, the rotting timber cover sitting crooked over the shaft. He hadn't finished the well, she said. The papers say he was trying to reach the basin directly, establish physical proof that the water source exists, not just survey maps which can be argued against. Actual water, drawn from this property. Dodd followed her gaze. Finishing that well is a month of work, maybe more, depending on what's down there. Then we'd better start today. He was quiet again. She had noticed, in the days since they'd arrived, that Dodd's silences were not empty. They were working silences, the kind where a man turned something over carefully before deciding what to do with it. He had a face that had been weathered past revealing much, but his eyes were sharp and not unkind. I'll need to know what exactly is in those papers, he finally said. If we're going to do this the right way, I need to understand what we're carrying. Marin looked at him. Are you sure you want to be involved? He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. Ma'am, I drove you out here. I'm sleeping in your barn. I've been involved since Briggs at the depot had that look on his face. He finished his coffee. Besides, he said, and his voice shifted slightly into something quieter and more private. I worked this land for Hartwell for 3 months 2 years ago. He was a good man, paid fair, said what he meant, didn't waste words. A pause. He deserves better than to have had all that work go into a box in the ground. Marin held that for a moment. All right, she said. I'll show you the papers after the girls are up. She turned toward the barn, then stopped. Dodd, she said. Thank you for the coffee. He nodded once, already turning back to the fire. The days that followed took on the structure of necessity, which is the only structure that survives a frontier winter. They worked from first light until they could no longer see, and sometimes past that, by lantern and firelight. The routine established itself the way all routines do on working land, not by plan, but by the logic of what needed doing and who was there to do it. Abigail took the fields. This surprised no one who had spent more than 20 minutes with her. She had her father's eye for the land, walked the property lines each morning, assessed what could be salvaged from the overgrown kitchen garden behind the ruined house, identified which section of the south field might still yield something if they could get seed down before the first hard frost. She worked with Marin in the mornings and alone in the afternoons, and she did not complain, and she did not ask for praise, and she drove herself at a pace that made Marin, who was not a woman of soft habits, look up occasionally just to make sure the girl was still standing. One afternoon, Marin found her sitting in the middle of the cleared field, not working, just sitting. Marin approached and sat down beside her in the cold dirt without saying anything. After a while, Abigail said, He used to sit here. Your father? In the evenings, after supper. He said it helped him think. She picked up a handful of soil, let it sift between her fingers. He said land that looks dead usually isn't. It's just waiting for someone to pay attention. Marin looked at the dry field around them. He wasn't wrong. He was wrong about some things, Abigail said. Not harshly, but with the particular honesty of a daughter who had loved her father clearly enough to see him clearly. He trusted too easily. He thought if he built a good enough case, the law would just work, that someone in authority would look at his evidence and do the right thing. Her jaw set. He didn't account for the fact that the person he was building the case against was the law. Marin didn't answer immediately. The wind came across the field and moved through the dry grass at the far edge. He was right about the well, Marin said. That's not nothing. Abigail looked at her. In the afternoon light, she looked older than 11. Not in a sad way exactly, but in the way that children who have been handed adult weight carry it. Are you going to finish it? We're going to try. And then? Then we have physical proof, not just documents. And physical proof is harder to dismiss. Marin met her eyes. It won't be fast. It won't be easy. And there will be a point where things get worse before they get better. I need you to know that. Abigail studied her for a long moment. Everyone in town thinks we're going to fail, she said. It was a statement, not a complaint. Most of them, Marin agreed. Does that bother you? Marin considered the question honestly. It tells me where we stand, she said. It doesn't change what we have to do. The girl looked back at the field. Then slowly she poured the soil she was still holding back onto the ground. Okay, she said, and stood up and went back to work. Nora found her purpose in a different way, through observation and documentation. She had begun, almost from the first day, keeping a record in the blank pages of a small ledger book they'd found in the root cellar. She drew maps. She recorded weather, what they ate, what work was done each day. She drew the property as it was, and in lighter pencil beside each drawing, as it could be. She never announced this project or asked permission for it. She simply did it, in the quiet hours. And when Marin noticed and looked over her shoulder one evening, she found pages of meticulous, detailed drawings that would have done credit to a trained surveyor. Nora, Marin said quietly, these are remarkable. Nora looked at the drawings as though she hadn't entirely decided what she thought of them yet. I just draw what I see, she said, and what makes sense for what I see. That's called having a good eye. Marin turned a page and found a detailed rendering of the unfinished well, cross-sectioned, with the approximate depth and the geological layers Dodd had described marked in Nora's small, precise hand. Where did you learn to do this? Papa, Nora said. He showed me how to read the survey maps. I liked the way everything had a logic to it, the way lines meant something. She paused. He said the land always tells you the truth. You just have to know how to read it. Marin set the ledger down carefully. I think your drawings may matter a great deal, she said. Will you keep making them? Nora looked at her with an expression that was almost amused, as though the idea of stopping had not occurred to her. I wasn't going to stop, she said. Lucy remained the quietest. She followed Marin with the consistency of a small, copper-haired shadow, not clinging exactly, but present, always within arm's reach. She did not talk much, but she was not blank. She watched everything with large, serious eyes, and occasionally she asked questions that arrived without preamble and hit with the accuracy of thrown stones. On the fourth morning, while Marin was repairing the gap in the fence line along the south boundary, and Lucy was sitting nearby with her rag doll, the small girl said, without looking up, Are you going to leave? Marin stopped working. What? Papa left, Lucy said. She said it flatly, the way very young children say enormous things, without armor, without any attempt to soften it. He didn't mean to, but he left. She pressed the doll's button eye with one finger, then looked up. Are you going to leave us too? The question sat in the cold morning air between them. Marin set down the fence post driver and walked over and crouched beside the small girl in the grass. She thought carefully before she spoke, because she was not a woman who made promises lightly, and she had a precise understanding of what she could and could not control. I'm not going to choose to leave you, she said. I can't promise nothing will ever happen to me, because I can't promise that about anything in this world, and neither can anyone else. But I can promise you that I will not walk away from this family as long as I am standing. She held the small girl's gaze. Do you understand the difference? Lucy thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she nodded once. Then she climbed into Marin's lap without asking, and held her rag doll, and they sat there together in the cold grass for a moment before Marin put her arm around the small, warm weight of her and breathed. She had not held a child like this in a year and a half. The feeling of it moved through her like something physical. Not pain exactly, not joy exactly, but the place where those two things existed in the same moment, like a door being opened that she had locked from the inside. She held Lucy for a long time. Then she kissed the top of her copper head and stood up and went back to the fence. Work on the well began the following week. Dot assessed the existing shaft, 11 feet down, Edmund Hartwell's careful work still visible in the smooth walls, the measured descent, and declared it structurally sound. What had burned was the wooden housing and the surface mechanism. What remained was a shaft aimed in the right direction, lacking only the final depth to reach what the survey map suggested was down there. How far? Marin asked, standing at the edge and looking down into the darkness. Dodd shrugged. Hartwell's notes say he was estimating another 15 to 20 feet, but he'd been tracking the rock formations. He held up one of the survey pages. See how he marks the limestone layer here? That's your signal. Once you're through that, according to his readings, the basin is below. And you trust his readings? His readings are better than anything the county surveyor has produced in a decade. He looked at her. Woman, that man knew what he was doing. They began the descent in shifts. Dodd, who had done well digging before and understood the work, going down on the rope in the mornings while Marin managed the surface, and Marin taking a turn in the late afternoons when Dodd's shoulders gave out from the effort. It was exhausting and slow and occasionally frightening. The shaft was narrow, the rope rough against the palms, the darkness below absolute until you struck a light against it. The soil changed texture as they descended, moving from the packed clay of the upper layers into harder, closer-packed material that resisted the iron-tipped bar they were using to break ground. They found the limestone at 16 feet. Dodd surfaced that afternoon with white dust on his coat and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, said, excitement, carefully contained. He was right, he said. It's exactly where he marked it. How deep before we're through it? Hard to say. Limestone can go a foot, can go 10, but it's a good sign. It means the geology matches his maps. Marin looked at the shaft. Then we keep going. They kept going. It was during this period that Blackstone Ridge began to push back. Not dramatically. Not yet, but in the small, consistent ways that a town under one man's influence makes its displeasure known. When Marin went to the general store for supplies, the owner, a wiry man named Pudge Carver, found reasons to be slow, to be out of stock, to charge above the standard rate, and then feign confusion when she challenged it. When she attempted to file a formal claim of guardianship at the county recorder's office, the clerk, a thin, bird-like man who seemed incapable of meeting her eyes, informed her that the paperwork had been misrouted and would need to be resubmitted, and that the processing time was currently 8 to 12 weeks, and that there was nothing to be done about it. When she walked down Main Street with the girls, conversation stopped. People looked, then looked away. Not all of them with hostility, some with what looked like sympathy or guilt, or the particular expression of people who have learned that involvement costs too much. But the effect was the same. They were alone in a town of perhaps 400 people, and the town had decided, by whatever combination of pressure and compliance and quiet instruction, that she and 3 orphan girls were someone else's problem. One exception presented itself on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week. A woman named Vera Stokes, perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair and the directness of someone who had survived enough to stop caring about social costs. She intercepted Marin outside the post office and pressed a cloth-wrapped package into her hands without ceremony. Salt pork and dried apples, she said. Don't make a thing of it. Marin looked at her. Why? Because I knew Cal Hartwell for 15 years, the woman said, and because I know what Hale is. She glanced down the street with the casual alertness of someone accustomed to watching for observation. He's had people watching your property twice this week. Did you know that? Marin went very still. No. 2 riders. They sit the ridge east of your fence line for an hour or so, then move on. Vera's eyes returned to her. Whatever Hartwell left behind, if it exists, you should be careful with it. What do you know about what Hartwell left behind? The older woman's expression was complicated. Cal told people he was onto something, not the details. Cal was careful, but people noticed he was spending all his time at that well. People noticed Hale's men were suddenly riding his fence line. She paused. And then Cal died. And people noticed that too. A coldness moved through Marin that had nothing to do with the October air. Do you think Hale? I think Calvin Hartwell was 52 years old and healthy as a horse the last time I saw him, Vera said flatly. And I think Corwin Hale does not leave things to chance. She squeezed Marin's arm once, briefly. Watch your back, Mrs. Calloway, and watch those girls. She walked away down the street at a brisk pace that discouraged being followed. Marin stood on the post office steps holding a package of salt pork and dried apples. and felt the shape of what she was dealing with shift and solidify into something considerably more dangerous than she had let herself fully acknowledge until now. She had been thinking of Hale as an adversary, powerful, well-connected, legally entrenched. She had not, until this moment, allowed herself to think of him as someone who might have already killed once to protect what he'd built. She walked back to the property. She did not hurry, because she had already learned that hurrying when frightened was its own kind of signal. She watched the ridgeline on the east side of the fence and saw nothing. No riders, no movement. But the emptiness felt different now. Observed. That evening she sat with Dodd after the girls were asleep and told him what Vera had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire. "I've been watching the ridge," he said finally. "Thought I caught movement up there 2 days ago. Told myself I was imagining things." "You weren't." "No." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "We need to move the papers. They're under the hearthstone. If someone comes looking, really looking, a hearthstone is not going to hold them." He thought for a moment. "The well shaft. Hartwell built a ledge about 8 feet down. I found it 2 days ago. Didn't understand what it was for until just now. Recess cut into the wall. Big enough for that tin box." Marin nodded slowly. "He built a hiding place." "He knew someone might come looking," Dodd said. "Damn it, he knew." She looked at the dying fire. She thought about Edmund Hartwell, a man she had never met, who had written letters about watching the light hit the ridgeline for 4 minutes every morning, who had gone down into a well alone and found a secret large enough to change the valley and dangerous enough to kill him, who had locked the evidence in a tin box and given the key to his eldest daughter and died before he could use it. "We move the papers tonight," she said, "and we keep digging." They were 21 feet down when they hit water. It was a Saturday morning, 3.5 weeks after their arrival. Dodd was below. Marin was at the surface managing the rope and the pulley they'd rigged from salvaged barn hardware. The morning was clear and cold, the sky the particular hard blue of deep autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone fully golden and were beginning to let go of their leaves. She heard it before he signaled. A change in the sound coming up from the shaft, something different in the echo. Then the rope went slack, and she heard Dodd's voice rise from the darkness below, stripped of its usual careful flatness, cracked open with something raw. "Marin." Just her name, but the way he said it. She leaned over the shaft opening. "Dodd? Get the girls." She straightened and turned toward the barn and raised her voice. "Abigail, Nora, Lucy. Come out here." They came at a run, Abigail first, wiping her hands on her work apron, reading Marin's face for signals. Nora behind her with the ledger already in her hand, as though she'd known she would need it. And Lucy last, trotting with her doll tucked under one arm and her copper hair loose around her face. They gathered at the edge of the well shaft. From below, barely audible, came the sound of water. Running water, living, moving water, deep in the dark earth below the burned remains of their home. Lucy leaned forward and looked down into the shaft. Her small face was intent and serious. Then something moved across it. Slow, certain, like sunrise. And she looked up at Marin with eyes bright and wide. "Papa was right," she said. Marin looked at the three of them. Abigail, who had uncrossed her arms without knowing it. Nora, who was already opening her ledger. Lucy, who was holding her doll straight up as though to show it what they'd found, and felt something gather in her chest that she would not name for some time, because she had not had occasion to feel it in so long that she wasn't certain at first what it was. It was hope, not the cautious, guarded kind she had been permitting herself. The real kind, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Deep in the earth, beneath the Hartwell homestead, the water ran on, vast and cold and patient, waiting since before any of them were born, waiting through the drought and the fire and the grief and the small, desperate arithmetic of 43 cents, waiting, as all true things wait, for someone with the courage to go all the way down and find it. The water changed everything, and not all of it in the ways Marin had hoped. Word traveled fast in a small town, faster than she would have liked, and in directions she hadn't anticipated. By the following Monday, 4 days after Dodd had surfaced from the well shaft with water on his boots and wonder in his face, Marin could feel the shift in the air when she rode into Blackstone Ridge for supplies. It was subtle, The kind of change that doesn't announce itself but accumulates in small moments. A conversation cut short when she entered the general store. Two men on the steps of the land office who watched her pass with an attentiveness that was not casual. Pudge Carver, measuring out her flour with an expression he was working hard to keep neutral, not quite succeeding. Someone had told someone, and that someone had told Corwin Hale. She didn't know that with certainty. Not yet. But Vera Stokes caught her arm outside the post office again, 2 days later, with none of the packages of salt pork that had made the first interception seem charitable and almost warm. "He knows," Vera said without preamble. Her voice was low and her eyes were already moving down the street. "He knows you finished the well." Marin kept her own expression still. "Does he know what we found?" "He suspects. That may be worse." The older woman released her arm. "He'll move on the debt claim first. That's his method. He'll argue Hartwell's estate owed money to the County Water Authority, which Hale controls through 3 men on the authority board. He'll file for foreclosure on the debt and try to take the land legally before you can establish anything." A pause, precise and deliberate. "I've seen him do it 4 times in the last 8 years. Always legal, always clean." "How long do we have?" "If he filed today, 30 days before the notice period expires. Maybe less if he finds a way to shorten it." Vera looked at her directly. "You have to get to the Capitol, Mrs. Calloway, with the papers and with whatever you pulled up from that well. You have to get in front of the Territorial Land Commission before he closes the door." Marin thought about the mountain pass, the 4-day ride, the tin box currently hidden 8 feet down a well shaft, the 3 girls at home with Dodd, the 37 cents she had left after the last supply run. She had spent 6 cents on nails. "All right," she said. Vera stared at her. "That's it? All right? What would you prefer?" The older woman looked at her for a moment with something close to exasperation and then something closer to respect. "I have a brother-in-law in the Capitol," she said. "Retired now, but he spent 20 years as a land surveyor for the Territorial Authority. He knows people. He understands what you'd be bringing them." She pressed a folded piece of paper into Marin's hand. "His name and address. Tell him Vera sent you." Marin pocketed the paper. She was already thinking through the timeline. What needed to happen? In what order? How fast? "Thank you, Vera." "Don't thank me." The woman turned briskly away. "Thank me by not losing." The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday, nailed to the fence post at the edge of the Hartwell property. Not handed to Marin in person, not mailed, not presented with any of the legal ceremony that might have allowed her to respond in the moment. Simply there. When Abigail went out to check the fence line in the morning and came back with the paper in her hand and a face stripped white with the effort of staying controlled, Marin read it at the kitchen table. They had a table now, salvaged from an abandoned claim property 2 miles east that Dodd had located and dragged back on the wagon. She read it twice, carefully, while the girls watched her and the fire popped in the iron stove and the smell of the morning's cornbread hung in the air. The claim was precisely what Vera had described. A debt assertion from the County Water Authority, claiming Edmund Hartwell had owed $42 in unpaid water access fees, and that the estate was liable. The notice gave 30 days before the county would move to seize assets in satisfaction of the debt. Since the primary asset was the land itself, the implication was clear. $42. 6 cents more than she'd arrived with. "Can they do that?" Nora asked. She had the ledger open on the table beside her. Already documenting, already recording, date, content, source. "They're trying to," Marin said. "Is it legal?" "Probably not, on its own." She set the paper down. "The Water Authority fee structure Hartwell supposedly owed under. I'd need to see the actual ordinance, but based on what I've read in his papers, Hale wrote those fees specifically to target land he wanted. The ranchers who pay on time are protected from enforcement. The ones he's after get a notice like this." She looked at the paper again. "It's a tool, not a legitimate debt. So we fight it," Abigail said. She was standing by the stove, arms crossed, with the specific expression she wore when she had already decided something and was waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. "We fight it," Marin agreed, "but fighting it from here through local courts means going before a judge who is either in Hale's pocket or afraid of him. We'd lose. Probably quickly." She looked at each of the 3 girls in turn. "I have to go to the Territorial Capitol. I have to take Hartwell's evidence directly to the Land Commission and file a counterclaim before that 30 days runs out." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Lucy, from her place at the end of the table, said, "How long will you be gone?" The question landed exactly where Maren knew it would, in the place she'd been carrying since the morning she'd crouched beside Lucy in the cold grass and made a promise she intended to keep. 6 days, she said, maybe 7. Dodd stays with you. You keep working the well casing and the fence line. You do not answer the door to anyone you don't know, and if anyone from town comes on the property without invitation, you find Dodd immediately and let him handle it. She looked at Abigail. You're in charge while I'm gone. Abigail lifted her chin very slightly. Not arrogance, recognition, the acceptance of a weight she had been carrying in some form all her life. Okay, she said. And Nora Bees, I need your maps. The property drawings, the well cross-sections, every annotated sketch you've made of the basin measurements, neatly organized. I'll take them with the papers. Nora was already moving toward her ledger stack in the corner. I'll have them ready tonight. Maren looked at Lucy last. The small girl had both hands wrapped around her tin mug of morning water. Water from their well, from the basin below, clean and cold and real. She was watching Marion with eyes that knew something was being asked of her, even if she couldn't name precisely what. I will come back, Maren said. Not, I'll try. Not I intend to. I will come back. Lucy nodded once. Then she looked at her mug and took a careful, deliberate sip, as though demonstrating that she was steady and intended to remain so. She left 2 mornings later before full light, on a horse borrowed from a rancher named Tomas Reyes, a compact, weathered man who ran cattle on the west side of the valley and who had appeared at the property the previous afternoon with a gray mare and the clipped, careful manner of someone doing something he didn't fully want to be seen doing. My wife knew Cal Hartwell from church, Reyes said when Maren asked why. He was looking at the mountains, not her. She cried 3 days when he died. A pause. The mare's name is Fern. She doesn't like sudden movements. Other than that, she'll take care of you. Thank you, Mr. Reyes. He gave a short, uncomfortable nod and left quickly, which Maren suspected meant he was frightened and helping her anyway, which she thought was possibly the more courageous version of bravery. She rode with the tin box in her saddlebag, and Nora's drawings rolled in an oilskin tube strapped across her back, and she did not look behind her at the property as she left, because she had found, in the weeks since she'd arrived, that looking back was the thing most likely to undo her. The mountain pass was 4,000 feet at its highest point, and in the last week of October it had acquired a temperament. The trail narrowed to single width in places, with exposed rock faces on the uphill side and a long, patient drop on the other. The wind came off the peaks in lateral gusts that made Fern's ears go flat and her gait go sideways, and Maren talked to the horse in low, continuous tones that were as much to steady herself as the animal. She camped the first night in a shallow draw off the trail, under a stand of fir trees that cut the wind to bearable, and ate cold cornbread and dried beef from the saddlebag, and sat close to a fire no larger than she absolutely needed, and tried not to think about what was happening in her absence. She thought about it anyway. She thought about the fence post with the foreclosure notice nailed to it, bleached white in the cold air. She thought about Hale's pale blue eyes across the council table, patient as ice. She thought about the way he'd said 43 cents, not as an insult, but as a conclusion. She was not 43 cents anymore, she thought. She was a well full of water and 6 months of a dead man's careful work and 3 girls who deserved the future their father had built toward. She reached the capital on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Millhaven was a real city by territory standards, 2,000 people, a proper courthouse, a land commission office in a 3-story stone building that looked like it was trying to suggest permanence. Vera's brother-in-law, a man named August Fenner, lived in a narrow house on Carpenter Street and opened the door to Maren's knock, with the expression of someone who had been told to expect something and was now recalibrating against the actual thing. He was perhaps 65, with a surveyor's hands, large, precise, and eyes that were professionally accustomed to looking at things carefully. He looked at Maren for a moment, then at the saddlebag she was carrying, then back at her face. "You look like you rode the pass in October," he said. "I did." "Then you'd better come in." She laid everything on his kitchen table. The survey documents, the annotated maps, the letter Edmund Hartwell had addressed to whoever finds this, and the measurements Nora had compiled in her ledger. Fenner looked at them for a long time in silence, moving papers with deliberate hands, occasionally holding a page closer to the lamp. "These are Hartwell's?" he said. "His measurements, his maps. The letter is his. Some of the cross-section drawings are his daughter's. She's 8 years old, and she has her father's eye." Fenner looked up. Something in his expression shifted. He returned to the papers. More silence. "If this is accurate," he said carefully, "what Hartwell found is not a local water source. It's a regional basin. The eastern reach here," he pointed to the annotated map, "this would extend beneath at least 15 individual ranch properties in the valley." "Yes." And Hale's Water Authority filings, if he had already established prior claim on the basin access, he would control the water supply for every ranch in the valley, Marin said. Every one. He could price them out, dry them up, or simply hold them hostage to whatever he chose to demand. She paused. He's been positioning for this for more than a decade. Hartwell traced the pattern of his land acquisitions, the water right filings, the carefully engineered failures of competing ranches. It's all there. Fenner sat back in his chair. His face was grave. "Do you know what you're accusing Corwin Hale of?" "I know exactly what I'm accusing him of. He has allies in this capital. He has allies on this commission." He looked at her steadily. "This will not be a simple filing." "I know," Marin said, "but I have 30 days before his foreclosure notice expires on the Hartwell property. And I have a well full of water on land that every legal survey in that box says belongs to those 3 girls. She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you whether it will be simple. I'm asking you whether the evidence is sound." Fenner looked at the papers on his table for a long moment. "The evidence," he said carefully, "is among the most thorough private survey work I have seen in 30 years in this field." A pause. Hartwell knew what he was doing. "Then help me get it in front of the right people." He was quiet. She waited. She had learned in the weeks since arriving in Blackstone Ridge that there was a particular kind of silence that came before a person decided to be brave, and it was worth letting breathe. "There is a commissioner," he said finally. "Name of Aldous Price. He is one of perhaps 3 members of the full commission who Hale has not managed to compromise. I know him from my surveying years. We worked the northern claims together in the 1860s. He's stubborn, he's honest, and he is going to want verification of every single data point in these maps before he sticks his neck out." Fenner looked at her. "But if I tell him Vera sent you, and if this evidence is what it appears to be, he will listen. How soon can you reach him?" "Tomorrow morning." He began organizing the papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades knowing which documents mattered and how to handle them. "You'll need a formal counterclaim filing against the foreclosure notice. I can help you draft that tonight, and you'll need a sworn statement describing how and where you found the evidence, with witnesses if possible." He looked up. "Do you have witnesses?" "Caleb Dodd. He was present when I found the papers. He helped dig the well and can testify to the water source." "A former ranch hand. Not ideal, but it's something." Fenner set his reading glasses on the table. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be honest with you about one thing. Please, even if Commissioner Price acts immediately, even if the filing goes through and a temporary stay is issued, Hale will fight it. He has resources and connections and the patience of a man who has been playing a long game for a very long time. A legal stay buys you time. It doesn't end this." "I know," she said, "but it keeps the land in those girls' hands long enough to build the larger case. And once the investigation opens, other people start coming forward." Fenner nodded slowly. He understood. "People who have been waiting for someone else to go first." "That's the idea." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had ridden a mountain pass alone in October with a dead man's evidence in her saddlebag, and 30 days to stop a powerful man from completing a decade of theft. She could see him taking measure of her in the way that some people do. Not skeptically, but carefully. Trying to understand what kind of person does this. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't have one that would have made sense to give. "All right," Fenner said. He reached for a clean sheet of paper and uncapped his ink. "Let's start with the counterclaim." They worked through most of the night. Marin drafted, Fenner revised, and between them they built the kind of legal document that attempts to be airtight because it cannot afford to be anything less. The counterclaim cited the specific ordinance under which the water authority fee had been levied, cross-referenced the evidence of Hale's manipulated fee structure, and formally asserted the Hartwell estate's prior claim to the underground basin based on the survey documentation. Fenner added formal survey language around Nora's drawings that elevated them from a child's careful sketches, though that was already impressive enough, into properly annotated technical documents. At 2 a.m, Marin set down her pen and looked at what they had built. "Will it hold?" she asked. Fenner considered. "It's a strong filing. The evidence behind it is stronger. Whether it holds depends on whether we can get it in front of someone with the authority and the willingness to act on it before Hale finds out it exists." He capped the inkwell. "Price will see us at 8 o'clock. I'll send a note now." Marin sat back and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was exhausted in the way that goes past the body into something more fundamental. The exhaustion of sustained alertness, of constantly running calculations against a situation that kept expanding. She thought of Dodd at the property. She thought of Abigail, who would be managing everything in her absence with a competence that was simultaneously admirable and heartbreaking. She thought of Lucy drinking water from the well with both hands around her mug. "I will come back." Commissioner Aldous Price was a broad, deliberate man in his 60s with a white beard trimmed close and the kind of face that had clearly been used over a long career as an instrument of skepticism. He sat across from Marin and Fenner in his office on the second floor of the Land Commission building and read every page of the filing in complete silence, from beginning to end, without asking a question or changing expression. When he finished, he set the papers down. He looked at Marin. "You're the woman who claimed guardianship of the Hartwell children," he said. "Yes." "And rode this pass in October to file this counterclaim." "Yes." "And this evidence," he touched the survey documents, "was found by you on the Hartwell property, in a tin box, in a root cellar, with a key held by an 11-year-old girl," Marin said. "Yes." Something moved briefly in Price's expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, and quickly passed. He looked at Fenner. "August, verify the survey methodology for me." Fenner walked him through it, point by point, in the patient technical language of a man who had spent his career in precisely this territory. Price asked questions, sharp ones, specific ones, the questions of someone who understood the field and was testing the evidence rather than the witness. Fenner answered each one. The answers held. When they were finished, Price sat in silence for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. "If I issue a temporary stay," he said, "Hale will know by end of day. He'll challenge it." "Yes," Marin said. "And you have 30 days on the foreclosure notice." 26 now. He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Is there anything in this filing, any piece of evidence, any claim, any assertion, that you are not completely certain of?" She thought about it honestly. "The precise eastern reach of the basin," she said. "Hartwell's maps extend to a certain point and then are estimated from geological inference. A formal territorial survey would either confirm or adjust that boundary. Everything west of the Reyes property line is directly documented. Everything east of it is strongly supported inference." Price nodded slowly. "That's the honest answer." He picked up the filing. "I'll issue the temporary stay this afternoon. It buys the estate 60 days from today, during which time the foreclosure action is suspended pending review." He set it down again. "I will also be writing a formal request to the Territorial Attorney's Office for an independent investigation into the Water Authority's fee assessment practices over the past decade. That is a separate action, and it will take time." Marin exhaled, very carefully. "Thank you, Commissioner." "Don't thank me yet." His voice was not unkind, but it was precise. "Hale is going to respond. He has the resources to make this extremely difficult, and he has allies on this commission who will work against the investigation at every opportunity. What you've started today is not over. It's barely begun." He looked at her with the steady, unromantic directness of a man who had seen a great deal of what power does to truth. "Can you go home and hold that land?" Marin looked at him across the wide desk, in the stone building that was trying to suggest permanence, in the territorial capital that was 4 days from the burned-out homestead where 3 girls were drinking water from a well their father had started, holding together in her absence with the stubbornness of people who have nowhere else to go. "Yes," she said, "I can hold it." She rode back through the pass on the 5th day, with the stay order in her saddlebag alongside the empty tin box. The sky above the ridge was an iron gray that promised snow within the week, and Fern moved with the steady, contained energy of an animal that knew it was going home. The wind came hard off the peaks, and Marin leaned into it, and she thought, 26 days gone, 64 days bought. The investigation opened. The door, once opened, can't be quietly closed. She came down off the ridge in the late afternoon and saw the smoke from the cook fire at the Hartwell property rising clean and straight in the still air below the tree line, and she felt the thing in her chest that she still wasn't quite used to feeling, that particular, almost painful warmth that is what home feels like when you have been afraid of losing it. She was perhaps a quarter-mile from the property when she crested a low rise and saw the riders, 4 of them, positioned along the east fence line. Not moving, just there, stationary in the failing light, watching the property from their horses with the patient, deliberate presence of men who had been told to be seen. A message, not an action, not yet. Marin reined Fern to a walk. She looked at the 4 riders for a long moment, and she thought about Corwin Hale in his gray coat, with his pale eyes, and his decade of careful, legal theft, and the patience of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. She thought, you know I went, you know I filed, you know the stay was issued. She looked at the smoke rising from the cook fire inside the fence line. She looked at the warm square of lantern light in the barn's half-standing wall. She turned Fern toward the gate and rode toward the light, and she did not look at the riders on the ridge, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow down. She came through the gate at a steady walk. Dot appeared in the barn doorway, assessed the situation with a single glance at the ridge and then at her face, and said nothing. She dismounted and handed him the reins. "They've been there since yesterday morning," he said quietly. "No one's crossed the line." "Good." She reached into the saddlebag and took out the stay order. She held it up so he could see what it was. Something moved across his face. Relief, maybe, or the expression that lives just next to it. Then the barn door opened wider and Abigail was there, and behind her Nora, and behind Nora, already running, copper hair flying, Lucy, who crossed the yard without slowing and hit Marin at full speed and wrapped both arms around her waist and held on with the full-body grip of a 5-year-old who had been holding very, very still for 6 days and was done holding still. Marin put her arms around the small girl and held her back, hard, and stood in the cold yard of the Hartwell homestead with the stay order in one hand and the riders at her back and the well behind her full of water that had been waiting in the dark earth for exactly this moment, and she breathed. "I'm back," she said, against Lucy's hair, quiet and certain and true. "I'm back." The riders stayed on the ridge for 3 more days after Marin returned. They didn't cross the fence line. They didn't approach the property or speak to anyone inside it. They simply existed there, in the cold morning light and the flat gray afternoons, 2 or 3 at a time in rotating shifts, patient, visible, deliberate. A reminder. The kind of pressure that doesn't need to announce itself because its meaning is entirely clear. Dodd watched them from the barn door each morning with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to read danger the way some people read weather. On the 4th morning, they were gone. That unsettled him more, he told Marin, than their presence had. "When a man like Hale stops showing you the pressure," Dodd said, "it means he's decided to apply it somewhere you can't see." He was right. It took 4 days to find out where. Thomas Reyes came to the property on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands and an expression of genuine misery on his weathered face. He stood in the yard and would not come inside, as though the conversation he had to have would be easier if he could still technically leave. "I need the mare back," he said. He was looking at the barn, not Marin. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway." Marin looked at him for a moment. She had suspected this, or something like it, from the shape of Dodd's warning. "What did he do?" Reyes pressed his lips together. "2 of my eastern grazing permits are up for renewal in February. The county water authority processes those renewals." He finally looked at her. His eyes were not without shame, which she thought mattered. "He didn't send anyone. He didn't say a word to me directly. A man came by to let me know that the renewal process had gotten complicated, that there were irregularities in my prior applications." A pause. "There aren't any irregularities. My applications have always been clean." "I know," Marin said. "If I lose those permits..." "You lose the east grazing." She kept her voice even. "I understand." She looked at him carefully. "Reyes, The investigation that's been opened in the capital, if it proceeds the way it should, Hale's control of the water authority will be dismantled. Those renewal permits will be processed by people he doesn't own. If it proceeds, Reyes said. If. He shifted his weight. I've got 4 children, ma'am. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. I'll have the mayor ready in the morning. He left quickly, the way he had come, with the discomfort of someone who knew the right thing and had chosen the survivable thing and understood the difference. She didn't blame him. She filed it carefully, alongside everything else she was carrying, the weight of being the person others couldn't afford to stand beside. Not yet. The investigation in the capital moved with the specific slowness of institutions that are built to be thorough and are additionally slowed by the interference of a man with significant resources and the motivation to delay. Commissioner Price sent word through Fenner, written in careful, neutral language that nonetheless communicated urgency beneath its surface, that Hale had retained a territorial attorney and filed a formal challenge to the stay order on 2 procedural grounds. Both grounds were, in Price's assessment, weak. Both would take time to dismiss. In the meantime, the stay held, the land held, and winter settled over the Hartwell property with the full weight of a Colorado Territory November. They finished the farmhouse frame in the last week before the first heavy snow sets, not the house itself, which would require weeks more work, but enough of a structure that they could seal it against the wind and cold with boards and canvas and the salvaged tin roofing that Dodd had tracked down from a collapsed outbuilding on the abandoned claim to the east. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it was shelter that was theirs, standing where the burned foundation had been, built up from what the fire had left behind. The night they moved from the barn into the half-finished house, Nora sat in the corner of the main room with her ledger and drew the interior by firelight. The iron stove in the center, the rough board walls with their canvas-patched gaps, the 4 sleeping pallets arranged in the far corner, the tin box now back above the hearthstone, since Marin had decided that hiding it suggested a vulnerability she no longer wished to project. Nora drew all of it with her careful, accumulating precision, and when she finished, she held the drawing up for the others to see. It doesn't look like much, she said, studying it with the critical eye of its creator, but it looks like ours. Abigail, who had spent the day hammering boards with a single-mindedness that had left blisters on both hands, looked at the drawing and then looked around at the actual room. Papa would have said it was a start, she said. He would have said it was a good start, Lucy corrected, with the absolute authority of the youngest child who has decided what is true. Marin looked at the 3 of them in the firelight. Abigail with her blistered hands and her composed face. Nora with her ledger and her artist's attention. Lucy with her doll and her solemn watching eyes, and felt the accumulation of the weeks behind them in her body like a physical weight she had stopped noticing until this moment when she briefly set it down. 6 weeks since she had stepped off the train. 6 weeks since the platform and the steam and the 43 cents and the dead man's letters in her hand. It felt like a year. It felt like a different life. It was, she thought. It was a different life. The question was whether they could keep it. It was Vera Stokes who came with the next piece of news, in the second week of November, arriving at the property in a borrowed wagon with a crate of preserved goods she announced were a gift, and that she would brook no argument about. 2 things, she said, when they were inside and the crate was deposited and she had accepted, under protest, a mug of coffee. First, Hale's hired 2 additional men, not riders this time. His new men are lawyers. He's filed a secondary challenge in the Capitol, arguing that your guardianship claim on the girls is invalid because you had no established residency in this territory at the time of filing. He's arguing the guardianship should revert to county authority, which means him. She looked at Marin over her mug. He's going after the girls to get to the land. The room was quiet. Abigail, who had been listening from the doorway, went very still. If he challenges the guardianship, Marin said, controlling her voice with effort, what's the legal standing? Fenner says it's a reach, but a reach that will take time and legal effort to defeat, which is the point. Vera set down her mug. He doesn't necessarily expect to win the guardianship challenge. He wants you spending time and resources fighting it instead of building the main case. What's the second thing? Marin asked. Vera's expression shifted, just slightly, and in a direction Marin hadn't anticipated. Not darker, something closer to light. Thomas Reyes came to see me yesterday. He brought 2 other men with him, Beck Callahan, who runs the cattle operation north of the creek, and a widow named Forsyth, who has a sheep operation out east. All 3 of them have water authority fee disputes going back 2 or more years. She paused. They want to talk to you. Marin looked at her. They want to know if their situations are connected to what you filed in the Capitol, Vera said. They're not brave yet, but they're angry, and sometimes anger comes before brave. She met the ranchers at Vera's house 3 days later. Reyes, Callahan, and the widow Forsyth, a lean, sun-darkened woman of perhaps 50. With the manner of someone who had stopped waiting for other people to solve her problems some years back, and had not looked back. They sat around Vera's kitchen table, and Marin laid out, in plain and careful terms, what Edmund Hartwell had found and what she had taken to the Capitol. She did not oversell it. She did not promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee. She told them what the evidence showed, what the investigation had opened, and what still needed to happen. When she finished, Callahan said, "How long has he been doing this?" Hartwell traced it back at least 12 years, probably longer. The rancher was quiet. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face that processed emotion slowly and thoroughly. "My father lost his east water access in 1874, he said. Hale told him the aquifer had shifted, that there was simply less water available than before. He looked at the table. He sold 300 acres to cover the loss, land that had been in our family for 15 years. Forsyth spoke without looking up from her own hands. My husband spent 2 years fighting a fee assessment before he died. He always said something was wrong with the numbers, that the fees didn't correspond to any actual water usage calculation he could make. She looked up then. He was right. Yes, Marin said. Reyes was looking at the window. If we testify, he said, to what's been done to us, does that help the investigation? Significantly, Marin said. Individual testimony from affected ranchers demonstrates a pattern of targeted fraud, not isolated incidents. It makes the case much harder for Hale's attorneys to argue as misunderstanding or administrative error. And Hale will know we testified, Callahan said. It was not a question. Yes, another silence. Then Forsyth said flatly, He already took my husband's peace of mind for 2 years and 600 acres of grazing land. What else has he got to take from me? She looked at Marin steadily. I'll testify. One by one, the others nodded. Marin wrote to Fenner that evening, a long, careful letter cataloging the 3 new witnesses, their specific disputes with the water authority, and the dates and amounts involved. She cross-referenced them against Hartwell's documentation. The pattern that emerged on paper was exactly what Hartwell had described. Targeted, methodical, spanning more than a decade, always just inside the boundaries of what looked legal from the outside. She sealed the letter and held it for a moment before handing it to Dodd to take to the post office. She thought about the secondary challenge Hale had filed against the guardianship. She thought about Abigail in the doorway, going still. If he comes for the girls through the courts, she said to Dodd, I will need to be in front of a local judge. That means whoever the circuit judge is when he passes through. Judge Mallon, Dodd said. He comes through in December. He's not Hale's man, I don't think. He's cautious. Doesn't like controversy. Then we give him something so clear he doesn't need to be brave, Marin said. Just correct. The confrontation she had been waiting for came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, under a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had decided definitively on winter. She was at the fence line with Abigail, repairing the last broken section, when she heard horses on the road, not the distant watchers on the ridge, close, coming up the track toward the property gate, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who did not expect to be turned around. There were 6 of them. 4 were men she didn't recognize, hired clearly by their identical expression of professional neutrality. The 5th was the clerk from the county recorder's office, looking as though he very much wished he were somewhere else. And the 6th was Corwin Hale. He rode a dark horse, well-maintained, and he wore his gray coat, and he sat in the saddle with the ease of a man who had been doing this, coming to places and having his way, for a very long time. He stopped at the gate and looked at Marin across it. Mrs. Calloway, he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, mild, conversational, the voice of a man who did not need volume. Magistrate, she said. I've asked the county recorder to serve the formal notice of secondary proceedings. He nodded toward the miserable clerk, who produced a paper and held it out. Marin did not move to take it. After a moment, the clerk leaned forward and set it on the fence post. The guardianship hearing is scheduled for the 14th of December, Judge Mallon's circuit. I'm aware, Marin said. I received correspondence from the court. Then you'll know the county is asserting that the original guardianship claim was improperly filed. Hale's pale eyes were attentive and entirely calm. I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Calloway. This can be resolved simply. The children will be placed with appropriate county-approved families. The property will revert to county authority to manage the estate's debts. You are free to remain in Blackstone Ridge or to move on. He paused. You came here with almost nothing. You don't have to leave with nothing. I'm sure an accommodation could be arranged. Marin looked at him. She thought about Edmund Hartwell in the dark of a well shaft, measuring and recording, building a case against this man month by patient month. She thought about a 5-year-old girl drinking water from her father's well with both hands around her mug. She thought about Abigail standing 3 feet behind her right now, absolutely still, hearing every word. What kind of accommodation? She asked. Her voice was entirely level. She wanted to understand exactly what he was offering, so there would be no ambiguity later about what she had refused. A modest sum, Hale said, enough to establish yourself somewhere more suitable, perhaps further west. He let the offer sit in the air between them, patient as everything else about him. Marin looked at him for a long, measured moment. She had not felt afraid of him, she realized. Not truly. Not in the way that closes down thinking. What she felt was a clarity so specific it was almost physical. The clarity of a person who has stopped calculating whether they can afford to fight and started calculating how. The investigation in the Capitol, she said quietly, has identified at least 14 instances of manipulated fee assessments across 11 properties in this valley over the past 12 years. We have 3 ranchers prepared to testify. We have survey documentation that establishes prior claim to the underground basin held by the Hartwell estate. And we have a stay order signed by Commissioner Price that is currently being upheld through 2 of your procedural challenges. She held his gaze. The 14th of December is going to be a public hearing, Magistrate. Judge Mallon, the county recorder, the press from the Millhaven Courier that Fenner has already been in contact with, said all of it public. She let a pause sit. You came here to offer me money to go away quietly. I think you understand that the quiet has already passed. Something moved in Hale's face. Very small, very brief. Not fear. She didn't think this man had encountered fear in some time, but something recalculating, something that recognized the shape of a situation it had not fully anticipated. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked, briefly, past her, at Abigail, standing behind her shoulder. You're gambling with their security, he said. Still mild, but the mildness had something new in it now. Whatever you believe about those documents, these children have no guarantee of their security, Abigail said. Both adults turned. Abigail Hartwell, 11 years old, stood at the fence line in her work apron with her blistered hands at her sides and her dark eyes absolutely steady. She had the expression of a girl who had been deciding something for a long time and had just finished deciding. Our security, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold air, is our land. Our father built that case so we could keep it. And she, a slight lift of her chin toward Marin, is finishing what he started. She held Hale's gaze with a directness that most adults in this valley had stopped being capable of. This is our property. You're at our gate, and we don't have anything to say to you. The silence that followed was the particular silence of something having shifted. A silence in which everyone present understood that the conversation was over and something else had begun. Hale looked at the girl for a moment. His face revealed nothing. Then he looked at Marin. The 14th, he said, and turned his horse and rode back up the track, and his 4 hired men turned with him, and the miserable clerk scrambled to follow, and the gate stood between them and the 2 figures who remained beside the fence, a woman and a girl, standing in the November wind, watching them go. When they were out of sight, Marin let out the breath she had been holding for the last 4 minutes. She looked at Abigail. The girl's chin was still lifted. Her eyes were very bright. You didn't have to do that, Marin said. I know, Abigail said. She paused. But he needed to hear it from us, not just from you. She picked up the fence post driver she'd set down when the riders arrived. "Can we finish the fence?" They finished the fence. The December hearing date moved through the valley like weather. People felt it coming before it arrived. Word had spread, the way word always does in small communities, through the particular channels of people who tell one trusted person what they have heard. The Millhaven Courier published a short article, factual, careful, citing the territorial investigation, that made its way to Blackstone Ridge in the hands of travelers, and was read, reread, and passed along with the attentiveness of people receiving information they had been forbidden to have. Vera Stokes reported that 3 more ranchers had come to her asking about the testimony process. Dodd, who had resumed his habit of riding into town for supplies, came back one evening and said simply, "People are talking, not out loud yet, but they're talking." The night before the 14th, Marin sat at the rough kitchen table with the tin box open before her and read Edmund Hartwell's letter one more time. She read it slowly, in the lamplight, in the half-finished house that stood on the ground where his house had stood. "This land is yours. Do not let anyone take it from you." She thought about this version of herself that had arrived on the platform 6 weeks ago, hollow-eyed, purposeless, carrying her grief and 43 cents and the letters of a man she'd never met. That woman had boarded a train going west because she had nothing else to move toward. She had not known then that going west would give her something to move toward, or rather, something to stand in front of, something worth standing in front of. She closed the letter and put it back in the tin box and closed the lid. Lucy appeared from the sleeping corner in the darkness, padding across the board floor in her stockings with her rag doll under her arm. She climbed into the chair beside Marin without asking and leaned against her side, heavy with sleepiness. "Tomorrow?" she said. "Tomorrow," Marin said. Lucy was quiet for a moment, then, "Are we going to win?" Marin put her arm around the small girl. She thought about the question honestly, because Lucy deserved honesty. "I think we're going to make it very hard for anyone to take this from us," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have." Lucy considered this. "That sounds like winning," she said finally, and closed her eyes. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on the Hartwell property. Soft, steady, covering the repaired fence line and the completed well casing and the cold ground in which the water ran deep and patient and entirely real, falling on a half-finished house where a lamp burned and a woman sat with a child against her side, holding everything they had built, waiting for morning. The morning of the 14th arrived the way important mornings often do, quietly, without ceremony, as though the day had not yet decided what it intended to be. Marin was up before light. She built the fire, put water on to boil, and stood at the canvas-covered window gap for a long time, watching the darkness outside turn slowly from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn. The snow from the night before had settled in a thin, even layer across the property. Not deep, just enough to make everything look clean and new and temporary, the way snow always does before the world wears through it again. She heard Abigail rise behind her without needing to turn around. The girl moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. By the time the water was boiling, Abigail was dressed and had her hair pinned and was helping Marin measure out the morning's cornmeal without being asked. They worked side by side in the pre-dawn silence for a few minutes. The comfortable, practical silence of 2 people who have learned to occupy the same space without requiring it to be filled. "Are you afraid?" Abigail asked. She didn't look up from the pot. Marin considered the question the way she had learned to consider Abigail's questions, seriously, without the reflex to soften. "Some," she said. "Mostly I'm focused." "What's the difference?" "Fear looks backward. Focus looks at what's in front of you." She paused. "Your father understood that. Every measurement in that tin box was a focused man." Abigail stirred the pot slowly. "He was afraid too, though," she said. "He hid the box. He gave me the key without telling me why." She was quiet for a moment. "I think he knew something might happen to him, and he was afraid it would happen before he was finished." Marin looked at her. "He finished it," she said. "He just needed someone else to carry it the last distance." The girl looked up then, and her eyes were bright in the firelight, not with tears, but with something that sits in the same place as tears and chooses differently. "Then let's not drop it," she said. They arrived in town at 9 o'clock. Marin, the 3 girls, and Dodd, in the wagon they had rebuilt from salvaged parts over the preceding weeks. The streets of Blackstone Ridge were not empty. That was the first thing Marin noticed. On a normal Thursday morning in December, the town's population distributed itself across its business in the ordinary way. A few figures moving between storefronts, the occasional wagon, the general and unhurried rhythm of a small community doing what it does. This morning was different. People had come out. Not obviously, not in a crowd, but in the particular way of people who have decided they want to be present for something without fully committing to what that presence means. They stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, gathered in the doorway of the Granger's supply building, clustered in loose groups at the corners. Some Marin recognized. Many she didn't. All of them watched the wagon move up Main Street toward the county building where Judge Mallin's circuit hearings were held. She sat straight on the wagon bench. She did not look at the watchers. She looked at the county building at the end of the street. "There are a lot of people," Nora said from the wagon bed. She was carrying her ledger, which she had not put down since breakfast. "Yes," Marin said. "Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet," Marin said honestly. "It means they're paying attention. What they do with that is still to be decided." The county building's main room had been arranged with chairs in rows facing a raised platform with a judge's table, functional, unornamented, smelling of old timber and the particular closed-air staleness of a room not frequently used for its official purpose. By the time Maureen and the girls entered, perhaps 40 people had already taken seats. More were filing in behind them. She had not anticipated this attendance. She did not think Hale had either. She could tell by the subtle tightening around his eyes when she walked in and saw him seated at a table to the left of the platform, flanked by two men in good coats, who had the practiced calm of professional attorneys. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. She settled the girls in chairs along the right wall, close enough that she could see them, far enough from the front that they were not in the direct line of everything that was about to happen. Dodd sat beside them with his arms folded and his expression suggesting that he was prepared to remain exactly where he was for as long as necessary, which was the most reassuring thing Marin could think of. Vera Stokes was already seated near the back. She caught Marin's eye and gave a single, small nod. The nod of someone who has done what they could do and is now waiting to see if it was enough. Beside her sat Fenner, who had made the ride from Millhaven in 2 days at Marin's written request, and who was carrying the counterclaim documents and a letter from Commissioner Price confirming the status of the territorial investigation. Reyes was there, and Callahan, and Forsyth, the three ranchers who had agreed to testify, seated together in the third row with the braced expressions of people who have decided to be brave and are not yet sure it was the right decision. Judge Mallin arrived at 10 minutes past 9. He was a spare man of 60, with rimless glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being impressed by either the powerful or the desperate. He sat, arranged his papers, looked around the room with the attentiveness of a man cataloging what he had walked into, and then looked at both tables. "I see we have a full house," he said dryly. "We'll proceed." Hale's attorneys opened with the procedural challenge. It was smooth work. Marin could admit that, even now. The senior attorney, a man named Pratt with silver-streaked temples and a voice calibrated for authority, laid out the county's position in clean, reasonable-sounding language. Marin Calloway had arrived in Blackstone Ridge on the 19th of October with no established residency, no legal ties to the community, and no prior relationship with the Hartwell children or estate. The guardianship claim she had filed was, therefore, procedurally defective under territorial family law, which required that a guardian claimant demonstrate either blood relation, documented prior relationship, or established community standing. Mrs. Calloway, at the time of filing, possessed none of these. It was a reasonable-sounding argument. It had the particular quality of Hale's methods generally, built on things that were technically true and pointed toward a conclusion that was fundamentally wrong. Fenner rose when Mallin invited the response. He was not a courtroom attorney. He was a surveyor, a technician, a man of measurements. But he was 65 years old and had spent a career presenting precise findings to skeptical officials, and he had the unshakable confidence of someone who knows his evidence is sound and his reasoning is correct. He set the counterclaim on the table before him and addressed Mallin in the same tone he might have used to present a topographical survey, methodical, unhurried, entirely certain. The procedural challenge rests on a specific interpretation of the standing requirement, Fenner said. But territorial family law also provides for emergency guardianship claim in circumstances where children face immediate risk of separation, harm, or displacement. Mrs. Calloway filed under this provision, which does not require prior community establishment. It requires only that the claimant be an adult of sound character who acts in the children's demonstrable interest. He set a document on the table. The filing was reviewed and accepted by the county clerk at the time of submission, which constitutes administrative recognition of its procedural validity. The current challenge is attempting to retroactively disqualify a filing that was accepted as valid at the moment of its creation. Pratt rose immediately. The clerk's acceptance was clerical, not substantive. Then I'd be interested, Mallon said, without looking up from the document he was reading, in the county's theory of when exactly the clock on validity begins, because your filing suggests it begins whenever it becomes convenient. He set the document down and looked at Pratt with the patient expression of a man who has seen this particular move before. Continue, Mr. Fenner. Fenner continued. He walked through the guardianship question methodically. Marin's documented actions since arriving, the rebuilding of the property, the care provided, the stability established, the legal filings made. He presented letters from Vera Stokes and from a woman at the church hall whose name Marin hadn't known, attesting to the character and conduct they had observed. He presented Nora's ledger, with Nora's permission, solemnly given that morning, as documentation of the property's restored condition, and watched Mallon look through it with an expression that moved, slowly, from judicial neutrality toward something closer to genuine attention. Then Mallon set the ledger down and looked toward the right wall of the room. "Which of you is Abigail Hartwell?" he asked. Abigail straightened in her chair. "I am, sir." Mallon looked at her for a moment. "You are the eldest of the 3 children at issue in this proceeding?" "Yes, sir." "How old are you?" 11, sir. I'll be 12 in February." "And you have been living on the Hartwell property with Mrs. Calloway since her arrival in October?" "Yes, sir." Mallon was quiet for a moment, still looking at her. Marin could see him seeing what everyone saw when they looked at Abigail with real attention. Not just a child, but a particular kind of person. The kind that makes you recalibrate your assumptions about what children are capable of. "Do you wish to remain in Mrs. Calloway's guardianship?" Mallon asked. He said it simply, as though the answer mattered, which in a court of law it technically did not have to. Abigail held his gaze. "She came back," she said. "She promised Lucy she would come back, and she did. She finished the well my father started, and she went to the capital alone to keep our land, and she's been working our property since October like it was already her home." A pause. "And it is. It's her home. She just doesn't always know it yet." Her voice was steady and clear and carried in the room without effort. "Yes, sir. I wish to remain." In the silence that followed, Marin heard, from somewhere in the rows of chairs, the sound of someone drawing a careful breath and releasing it slowly. She did not look to see who. She kept her eyes on Mallon. The judge looked at Pratt. "I'm dismissing the procedural challenge," he said. "The guardianship filing stands. If the county wishes to revisit this with a substantive challenge rather than a procedural one, it may refile with appropriate grounds." He made a note. "We'll move to the secondary matter." Pratt made a sound that was almost, but not quite, an objection, and then thought better of it. The secondary matter was the foreclosure notice, the $42 water authority fee debt that Hale had used as the mechanism to move on the property. This was where Fenner placed the full weight of Hartwell's documentation on the table, and where the morning began to change its shape. He presented the evidence in layers. First, the specific ordinance under which the fee had been levied, and the history of its application, which showed, through the county's own records, that the fee had been applied selectively to specific properties at specific times. Second, the cross-reference timeline of Hale's water authority acquisitions and the properties that had subsequently failed or been sold under financial pressure. Third, Edmund Hartwell's survey documentation, with Nora's annotated drawings submitted as supporting technical material, establishing the existence of the underground basin and the Hartwell estate's prior claim to it under territorial water law. And then he called the witnesses. Reyes went first. He sat in the chair before the judge's table and told his story in the plain, unvarnished language of a man who raises cattle and does not embellish. The permit renewals, the implied threat, the 2 years of inflated fee assessments on a water access he had used without dispute for a decade prior. Callahan followed and described his father's east water access, lost in 1874 to what he'd been told was a shifting aquifer. Forsyth went last, and she was the most precise of the three. She had records, kept in the careful habit of a woman who had learned not to trust anything undocumented, and she laid them on the table before Malin with the manner of someone delivering something long overdue. 2 years of fee assessments, the amounts, the dates, the correspondence she had received with Hale's Water Authority letterhead at the top. Pratt challenged each witness. He was good at it, finding the gaps in memory, the years where records were incomplete, the moments where testimony relied on inference rather than documentation. He planted doubt the way a skilled man plants seeds, quietly, in small quantities, trusting that some of them would grow. But the thing about planting doubt is that it works best in the absence of countering weight. And the countering weight in this case was the 6 months of work Edmund Hartwell had put into a tin box in a root cellar on a burned-out homestead. Hartwell had anticipated the gaps. He had cross-referenced his survey data against the county's own water authority filings that were public record, available to anyone who knew what to look for and was patient enough to look. He had documented the pattern not just through witness accounts, but through the structure of the filings themselves, the specific language used, the timing of assessments relative to property acquisition offers, the names that recurred across decades of transactions. When Fenner presented the final layer of documentation, the letter from Commissioner Price confirming that the territorial investigation had identified 14 affected properties and had issued a formal hold on all Water Authority fee enforcement actions pending review, something happened in the room. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, no gasp from the assembled audience, no visible crack in Hale's composure. But the air changed. The quality of the silence in the room changed. Marin had been watching people's faces through the morning, the townspeople, the ranchers, the council members who had come and sat in the back rows with the carefully neutral expressions of men who had not yet decided which way this would go. She watched those faces now, and she saw something moving through them that she recognized from her own experience of the previous months. The specific, recalibrating look of people who have suspected a thing for a long time and are now being given permission to know it. Malin read Price's letter twice. He set it down and removed his glasses and looked at the room for a long moment. Then he looked at Hale's table. "Mr. Pratt," he said, "your client chairs a county authority whose enforcement actions have been placed under a formal territorial investigation hold. I want to understand the county's position on the foreclosure notice in that context." Pratt was quiet for a moment, a beat longer than he'd been quiet at any previous point in the morning. "The county maintains that the fee assessment was lawfully issued under an authority whose practices are currently under investigation for fraud," Malin said, not raising his voice, simply naming it. "I am going to issue a stay of the foreclosure notice pending the outcome of the territorial investigation. The Hartwell estate will remain in the possession of its current occupants, Mrs. Calloway and the 3 Hartwell children, until the investigation concludes and a formal determination is made." He picked up his pen. "If the investigation finds the fee assessment to be part of a fraudulent pattern, the debt is void, and the estate's claim to the land, including the water rights established by the survey documentation presented this morning, is confirmed." He looked at Pratt. "If it finds otherwise, the county may refile." Pratt started to rise. "Your Honor, the county must object." "Your objection is noted and will be entered in the record," Malin said, already writing. "It will have an opportunity to be heard at the territorial level during the investigation review." He did not look up from his writing. "This hearing is concluded." What happened next was not loud. It was not a chorus of cheers or a dramatic eruption of the kind that happens in stories told afterward with elaboration. What happened was something quieter and, in its way, more significant. The room began to breathe differently. People looked at each other, ranchers and townspeople, and the council members in the back rows, with the specific expression of people who have been holding something tightly for a long time and are tentatively, cautiously beginning to put it down. Vera Stokes stood up and walked over to where Marin was standing and took her hand without saying anything. Reyes crossed the room and stood nearby, and Callahan and Forsyth, and they were joined by others, people Marin didn't know, faces she hadn't seen before. A woman who said only, "My family lost land in 1878, and gripped her arm briefly and then moved away. The room rearranged itself around the hearing's outcome, the way communities rearrange themselves around a shift in power, slowly, with some confusion, and not without a certain amount of looking to see what others were doing before committing. Hale left before it was finished. Marin saw him go. He rose from his table when Malin ended the hearing, and his two attorneys gathered papers with the efficient movements of people accustomed to tactical retreats, and Hale buttoned his gray coat and walked toward the door. He passed within 10 feet of her as he went, and he looked at her with those pale, careful eyes, and his expression was not rage. She had expected something closer to rage, something that would have felt more like a conclusion. Instead, it was the expression of a man who has encountered something he had not accounted for and is already calculating his next approach. He did not speak to her. He walked out into the December morning. She watched him go. She thought, this is not finished. And she thought, but the ground has shifted. And she thought, that is enough for now. What followed was not a single moment, but a season. The long, slow, grinding work of an investigation that was larger than any one hearing in any one county seat. Commissioner Price moved methodically in the way of institutional processes that have been set in motion correctly. Witnesses called, records subpoenaed, the Water Authority's own files examined by territorial surveyors who knew exactly what they were looking at and why. Fenner spent 3 months in Mill Haven providing technical testimony, cross-referencing the physical survey data against the legal record with the patience of a man who had been waiting 20 years for someone to ask the right questions. Hale fought it. Of course he did. He was a man who had spent a decade building a structure of legal and institutional control, and he dismantled it slowly, contesting each finding, challenging each witness, filing procedural objections with the dogged persistence of someone who understands that delay is its own form of victory. His attorneys were skilled and his resources were substantial, and there were moments, particularly in February, when a challenge to the survey documentation's admissibility consumed 3 weeks of process and nearly succeeded, when the outcome felt genuinely uncertain. During those months, Marin held the property the way you hold something fragile in difficult conditions, with both hands, with complete attention, without allowing herself to think too far ahead. The investigation's hold on the foreclosure notice kept the legal threat at bay. The stay order from Price remained in effect. But Hale's pressure on the community did not stop. It simply changed form, became more diffuse, less visible. A shipment of supplies that was delayed inexplicably at the railhead in Ridgecroft. A rumor, traced back to no particular source, that the survey documents had been found to contain inconsistencies. A night in January, when someone cut 2 sections of fence line on the east boundary, and they found the post pulled and the wire coiled neatly nearby, not vandalism exactly, but a message. Dodd spent 3 nights that week sleeping outside in a bedroll near the east fence, in temperatures that dropped below 0, without being asked to and without making much of it. On the 4th morning, he came in with frost in his beard and accepted coffee from Maureen and said, "Nobody's come back." "Thank you," Marin said. He waved it off. He had long since stopped being a man who could leave this property, and he knew it, and she knew it, and they didn't discuss it because there was nothing to discuss. In March, Forsyth brought her sheep operations full financial records to the investigation. 300 pages of meticulous accounting that she had kept, she explained to the territorial investigator, because her husband had told her in 1879 that if they ever had to prove anything, they would need the numbers. Her husband had been right about the numbers. The Forsyth records, cross-referenced with the Water Authority's own fee ledgers, provided what the investigation had been building toward. A documented chronological record of targeted fee manipulation that correlated with property acquisition attempts in 18 separate cases over 14 years. That was the weight that finally broke it. The territorial attorney's ruling came in April, specific, detailed, and unambiguous in the way that rulings are when the evidence beneath them is sufficient to require nothing else. Corwin Hale's Water Authority fee assessment practices were found to constitute systematic fraud under territorial statute. His personal financial interest in the properties affected by those assessments, documented through a web of holding companies and proxy purchases that the investigation had spent months unraveling, constituted corruption of a public office. All fee assessments levied under his authority against affected properties were voided. All water right acquisitions made through mechanisms connected to the fraudulent fee structure were subject to review and potential reversal. He was removed from the magistrate's office on the 12th of April. The County Water Authority Board, 3 of the 4 members of which resigned within the week, was dissolved pending reconstitution under territorial oversight. Criminal charges were referred to the territorial attorney's office for formal prosecution. Hale's attorneys released a statement that used words like dispute and disagreement and differing interpretations, which was the language of men trying to make something large sound small. Marin read the ruling at the kitchen table of the house they had finished building in February. A real house now, with proper walls and a shingled roof, and 2 rooms and a front door that opened onto the yard where the completed well stood with its new wooden housing, painted white by Nora on the first warm day of spring, with the word Hartwell lettered carefully above the casing in her precise hand. She read it twice. The same habit she'd developed, she noticed, with every important document. The reading twice to make sure the ground was what it appeared to be, and not shifting. Abigail was in the yard when Marin came out with the document in her hand. The girl was working the kitchen garden. They had put it in 2 weeks ago, on the first workable ground, with seed they had ordered from the catalog through the winter. She looked up when Marin appeared, read something in her face, and straightened slowly. Marin held up the ruling. Abigail walked to her, not running, but with the deliberate pace of someone who is letting themselves believe something before they arrive at it. She took the document and read it. Not all of it. She skimmed, picking up the weight of it, the shape. Then she looked up. "It's over?" she said. "The criminal investigation continues," Marin said honestly. "The legal machinery will run for some time yet, but the land is settled. The water rights are confirmed as belonging to this estate." She held Abigail's gaze. "It's over in the ways that matter most for now." Abigail held the document for a moment. She looked at the yard, the garden rows, the completed well, the finished house, the repaired fence running in clean lines around the perimeter of the property. Then she did something Marin had not seen her do since the first day in the church hall. She let her composure go. Just briefly. Just a moment. Just the few seconds it took for the pressure of 6 months to find a way out. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes and breathed in sharply, and then breathed out, long and slow. And when she brought her hand down, her eyes were very bright. "I'm going to tell Nora and Lucy," she said. "Go," Marin said. She watched the girl cross the yard at a run. Abigail, who never ran, who was always measured and deliberate, running in the April morning toward the barn where her sisters were. And Marin stood in the sun outside the house she had built on the ashes of a fire she hadn't lit, holding 6 months of work and a grief that had found its way into something else. And she breathed the spring air of the valley and felt, fully, completely, without qualification, the thing she had not allowed herself to feel since Daniel. The unguarded, unarmored sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The cooperative took shape through the spring and summer, in the gradual, practical way that good ideas usually do, not as a single decision, but as a series of smaller ones, each following from the last with the logic of necessity and shared interest. It began with Forsyth, who came to the property in May with a proposition as direct as everything else about her. Her sheep operation needed reliable water access for summer grazing. The Hartwell Basin could supply it, and she was prepared to pay a fair rate and to work rather than wait. Marin listened, and they talked, and by the end of the afternoon they had the outline of an agreement that Nora insisted on drawing up formally in her ledger, in the double-column accounting format she had apparently taught herself from a book over the winter. Reyes came the following week, then Callahan, then a rancher named Estella Brandt, who Marin hadn't met yet, but who had been watching, as many people in the valley had been watching, to see which way things settled before deciding what she wanted to do about it. One by one, through conversations over kitchen tables and across fence lines, the shape of the cooperative built itself from its component pieces: a shared water access agreement, a rotating maintenance schedule for the distribution infrastructure, a fair assessment formula that Nora, 12 years old by June, and possessed of a mathematical precision that had begun to alarm and impress the adults around her in equal measure, developed from first principles and presented to the group at the first formal cooperative meeting in the completed Hartwell farmhouse. It was that meeting, 11 ranchers from the valley, seated in 2 rooms and a doorway, with Nora standing at the front of the main room with her ledger and a confidence entirely disproportionate to her age, that Maureen thought of afterward as the moment the valley actually turned. Not the hearing, not the ruling, not any of the legal and institutional mechanics that had been necessary to get here. This moment, Nora Hartwell explaining the water distribution formula to a room of adults who were listening to her, actually listening, because the numbers were right, and she knew they were right, and there was nothing in her manner that suggested any other possibility. At one point, Beck Callahan interrupted with a question about the eastern reach of the basin and whether the formula accounted for seasonal variation. Nora turned to the relevant page of her ledger, found the calculation, and answered him in specific and unambiguous terms. Callahan looked at the calculation, looked at Nora, and said, with the deliberate honesty of a man not given to flattery, "Your father would have been proud." The room went briefly quiet. Nora looked at the formula in her ledger. "I know," she said, and continued. The criminal proceedings against Hale extended through the summer and into the fall. He retained good attorneys and contested everything with the methodical persistence that had characterized his entire career, and the wheels of territorial justice moved at the pace they always do, which is to say slowly and with friction. But the outcome, once the investigation's findings were formally entered into the prosecutorial record, was not seriously in doubt. In September, Corwin Hale entered a plea that avoided the full prosecution in exchange for a formal admission of conduct and the forfeiture of all assets acquired through the Water Authority fraud scheme, which was a considerable sum, and which the territorial court distributed in restitution to affected property owners, according to a schedule that took several months to calculate and implement. The Hartwell Estates portion of the restitution, combined with the confirmed water rights and the cooperative income, made the property, for the first time in years, genuinely solvent. Marin stood with Dodd over the ledger the evening they completed the first full accounting, and she looked at the numbers and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The particular steadiness that comes not from certainty about the future, but from knowing that the present has been secured by real work.
"Well," Dodd said, looking at the bottom line. "Well," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the elaborate casualness she had come to recognize as his mode of emotional disclosure, "I talked to Vera Stokes about that piece of land she has on the north boundary, the one that runs along the creek." Marin looked at him. "And?" "And she'd sell it at a fair price to a man who was planning to stay in the area." He studied the far wall. "Thought I might put a small cabin up, if nobody objects." "Nobody objects," Marin said. He nodded once, with the expression of someone who had asked and been answered and found the answer satisfactory. "Good," he said, and went to put more wood on the fire. The valley changed, not overnight, nothing real changes overnight, but in the steady, accumulating way of things that have been given the conditions they need to grow. The cooperative distributed water access across 17 properties by the end of its first full season. Families that had been losing ground for years found themselves with a reliable resource that they had never had reliable access to before. And what you can do with reliable water in a Colorado valley is not a small thing. Fields expanded, herds grew. The town of Blackstone Ridge, which had been contracting in the way that towns contract when fear replaces enterprise, began, cautiously, to expand again. A new story went up on the hotel. The school that had been running half sessions for 3 years resumed full days when enough children were enrolled to justify the teacher's full salary. Marin was aware of the change not as a single observation, but as the accumulation of small ones, the way people greeted her on Main Street now. Not the watched, guarded silence of the early weeks, but the ordinary warmth of a community towards someone who had done something worth doing. The way the girls moved through the town with an ease that had not been there before, claimed and rooted in the way children are when they understand that the ground they're standing on is theirs. On a September morning, nearly a year after she had arrived at the Blackstone Ridge Depot in a cloud of steam with 43 cents in her pocket and a bundle of letters she would never deliver, Marin walked out of the farmhouse at dawn and stood in the yard and watched the light come over the ridge. It came the way Edmund Greer, the man she had traveled west to marry, whose death had set everything else in motion, had described it in his letters.
the way he'd written about it with the reverence of someone describing a living thing. The light touched the ridgeline first, and for a few minutes, perhaps 4, she had never actually timed it. Everything turned gold. The completed well with Nora's white paint and careful lettering. The kitchen garden, full and green in the late summer abundance of a valley that had been returned to itself. The fence lines, repaired and straight. The house, solid and real, with smoke beginning to rise from the morning fire. She stood in it, the gold light, the 4 minutes, and she thought about the woman who had stood on the train platform a year ago, hollow with loss, moving west because staying still was no longer possible. She thought about Daniel the way she always did in quiet moments, but differently now. With the ache still there, still permanent, but with something alongside it that grief does not usually permit. The sense that love, once made, does not leave when the person it was made for does. That it persists and transforms and finds, if the person it lives in is willing to keep living, new forms and new directions and new faces to turn toward. She thought about a 5-year-old girl who had climbed into her lap in a cold field and trusted her with both hands. She thought about a girl with a ledger and a formula for water distribution. She thought about Abigail, who had stood at a fence line and told the most powerful man in the territory that they had nothing to say to him, and had been right. She heard the farmhouse door open behind her. Lucy came out in her stockings, still in her nightclothes, with her hair loose and her rag doll, more worn now, more loved, under one arm. She padded across the yard and stood beside Marin in the gold light and looked at the ridge. "You always come out here in the morning," Lucy said. "Yes," Marin said. "What are you looking at?" Marin considered. "The light," she said. "It does something to the ridge for a few minutes every morning. It's worth seeing." Lucy looked at the ridge with the serious attention she brought to things worth attending to. They stood together in the quiet yard and watched the gold work its way down from the ridgeline toward the valley, and the morning opened around them slowly, the way mornings do when you are in a place that has finally, after a great deal of work and a great deal of holding on, become home. After a while, Lucy reached out and took Marin's hand. Not the full-body grip of the frightened child who had asked, "Are you going to leave us in a cold field a year ago?" The simple, easy, unremarkable handhold of a small girl standing in her own yard with someone she belongs to. "Mama," Lucy said. She said it the way children say things they have been turning over for a long time and have finally decided are simply true. Without fanfare, without the weight of announcement. Just the word. The one complete sentence. Marin looked down at her. She felt the word move through her the way the gold light moved across the ridge, touching everything, illuminating what had always been there, lasting exactly long enough to be real. She tightened her hand around Lucy's small one. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's go inside and start breakfast. Your sisters will be up soon." They walked back to the house together, hand in hand, through the morning light of a valley that had been given back to itself. Through the yard of a homestead rebuilt from ash and 43 cents, and the stubborn, extraordinary refusal of a grieving woman to stop believing that something was still possible. The door opened. The fire was warm. The smell of coffee reached them before they crossed the threshold. In the field behind the house, the kitchen garden stood full in the September sun. The same soil that had looked dead and nearly worthless a year ago, now abundant with everything it had been waiting, all along, to grow. The valley flourished, and in it, on 32 acres of land that had been earned the hardest possible way, through evidence and endurance and the particular kind of love that doesn't ask whether it can afford to, a family was home.